Hey. Hey. Oh, Jeremy Corbyn. Hey. Hey, hey, hey. Hey, hey, hey.
I think we've all failed to act sufficiently quickly, sufficiently deeply. And the problem is bigger than I used to think. Things like, I hate Israel for pretending to speak for all Jews. You know, that it can only be seen, I'm afraid, as anti-Semitic.
We've supported hundreds of members and they've been reinstated to the party just over the past 8 to 9 months. Hundreds of members. I would like to know who else has been actively supporting members to be reinstated to the Labour Party when they've been unjustly suspended. Do you find this acceptable? What is the treatment I'm being given on this show?
I'm not watching all the comments, but I think there's a frustration with the suspensions, the expulsions, and people just feel that they want to fight back, and they feel that's
and
all
so
it is.
What does a fight back look like? Does a fight back look like giving literal, like, legal support and active solidarity by getting people reinstated in their hundreds? Is that what fight back looks like? So many of our resources into defending the left from the electoral college system, the reintroduction of the electoral college system, and we fought that and we won, and that was for the movement. We are in service of the movement. That is what active solidarity looks like. We get on and do it. We don't have, like, you know, we're not going to have a big rally telling you stuff. It's a waste of time. We are doing the active, granular organising, and that's what we want our members to be doing as well, and that's what we're supporting our members to be doing, because that's what building socialism looks like.
Good evening, comrades. Welcome to Red Line TV. Monday evening. We thought it's time to take a closer look at Momentum. There's a number of reasons to do so now. We actually put this program on when it turned out that Naomi Wimborne Idrissi of Jewish Voice for Labour was first supported by Momentum to run for the NEC of the Labour Party, and then they changed their view and withheld their endorsement. There was some confusion over some level of why that happened. We're going to take a closer look at that later in the program. We also want to speak to members from Momentum branches around the country, and we're going to speak to a former supporter of Momentum organizer. It's quite interesting. We're on the fourth leadership now of Momentum. I've counted. The first one was the one that included Jackie Walker. We're going to get to that. The second one then was just John Lansman with the newly set up NCG. Then he was booted out, and we've had Forward Momentum take over, and now there's another leadership which also includes Momentum organizers. We're going to take a look and see if that's actually made any difference to the way Momentum is run, and what the future of Momentum could be. And if we think there might not be a future for Momentum, what should the future for the left be? These are huge questions. We're going to talk about them tonight, but we're also going to talk about it next week in Have Your Say. So don't get annoyed or despair if you can't speak tonight. We will have a program next week where we can hear many, many people. First, before we start talking to Jackie and Graham, I wanted to share a couple of results from our survey. We did a survey and asked comrades what they, if they're still members of Momentum, etc. So we've got 80% of our viewers actually did join Momentum at some stage. 19%, almost 20% did not. I was quite surprised at this result. 41% still are. So there's quite half of those who did join are still members. I actually thought more people would have left. Of the ones who did leave, who are ex-members, most of them left because they think Momentum did not stand up to the witch hunt enough, and 45% left after the Lansman coup of 2017, which we'll be discussing. A few, 4%, actually were expelled because they were expelled from the Labour Party, and Momentum does not allow expelled members in its ranks. we are going to talk to this issue here. This is the John Lansman coup in January 2017. He abolished Momentum's democratic structures and established his own constitution and the National Constitutional Group. We're going to talk about this with Jackie Walker. Hi, Jackie. You're going to be the interviewee tonight, because you actually did play quite a big role in Momentum at the beginning. John Lansman called you up, didn't he? And that's quite an interesting way to appoint somebody to be a vice chair of a big organization. Tell us how that happened.
Yeah, I mean, it's typical in the way that John Lansman works, because always in Momentum you have this superficial sort of democracy thing going on, which just covers up the fact that John was doing pretty much exactly what he wanted. So he kind of called me into a room and he said, you know, would you like to be vice chair of Momentum? And I said, what? Well, how? And he said, well, you know, just go in there. I'm going to nominate you and you'll become vice chair of Momentum. And that is absolutely pretty much what happened, because of course what he thought was that he was getting a nice bit of black cover. He was going to get somebody reasonably empty-headed. I'm saying reasonably, I give him the benefit of that doubt. And I was basically there to do what his bidding was. And of course, when he got rid of me, just by coincidence, he just happened to put another black woman in their place, you know. So that's typical John Lansman.
Graham, you kind of know a little bit how Momentum was set up in the beginning and the role that John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn played, isn't it? It was an organised effort to try and cohere the Labour left.
Well, as soon as Jeremy became leader, there were various thoughts, attempts about setting up a rank and file organisation, but in effect, Momentum got the franchise. Now, whatever I say today, and I will be quite sharp, I say it in sorrow more than anger, in fact, and whatever comments I'll make about John Lansman, I've got to say, for many years, he was a reasonably close comrade of mine on the Labour left, going back some time. So I remember John McDonnell getting us, I think it was in the Labour Representation Committee, telling us about his plans. He had nice graphs and all of this. And it seemed that an organisation was going to be set up, comprising, which would be a company and have one director or member from each of the Labour left organisations, which seemed pretty good. But that actually didn't transpire. And we got, even the original constitution was not democratic in that it really did hand power to John Lansman. Now, I understand why that was done, because I don't think it was right, but I understand they had to act in a hurry and they needed somebody to take immediate effective action. And there is this underlying conflict between effectiveness and democracy. Now, there's always going to be some kind of conflict there, but I do think it's really important that finally to have destroyed accountability was the wrong thing to do. But to pretend that there wasn't an issue of trying to be effective and having to act quickly would be actually unfair. So let me bend over backwards to be unfair before to be fair before I actually criticise what subsequently transpired.
Effectiveness versus democracy. I mean, I think you can have both, obviously. I think most of us agree. And it is debatable how effective or democratic, you know, if actually the effectiveness increased, that is very debatable in Momentum. So we were late 2016. That was, you know, a few months before the general election, where Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn, did extremely well, and there were tens of thousands of people enthused, etc. We were planning for our first national Momentum conference towards the end of December. People started to elect delegates, etc. And then, Jackie, what happened?
Well, you've got to understand there was always a difference between those of us who saw the way of building the movement from underneath and giving local people kind of a control and say on what was happening, particularly in their local areas. And those who, like Lansman, I mean, Lansman just never ever had any idea of how to build a grassroots operation. In fact, he always said to me, you know, what does it mean? I don't know what it means. And so he had no idea about it. And of course, what happened was they pretended to be supporting the organization of this conference. They even sent one of their main people to us to help us organize the conference, when all the time—
You were on the conference arrangement committee, were you?
I was on the conference arrangements committee, when all the time what she was doing was in fact feeding back all the information to John Lansman. And so just at the crucial point when we were ready to have that the information about that conference going out, we had the coup, and the coup was done like that. It had already been organized. And of course, you know, what you've got to understand about this, it could not have been done without the agreement of John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn. Now, there's, you know, I can understand the reasons and the pressure that was there then. And I have absolutely no doubt that Lansman was able to press exactly the right buttons in terms of enforcing his will. But there was this extraordinary duplicity with which they allowed members to think that there was just about to be a democratic conference, that they were paying for the organization for it, and then they totally pulled the chair from it.
Graham, you knew John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn quite well. Do you agree with that assessment? And why was that conference, you know, why was that seen as a problem?
Well, firstly, I've got no first-hand knowledge at all about their role in this. However, it is inconceivable that John Lansman would have had the power to have taken that step without at least their silence or some kind of complicit agreement. It's out of the question. Again, I understand why they did it. If that's the way it was, I'm sure he said, well, if you don't agree to this, then you're going to lose your rank and file organisation, something along those lines, who knows? But he did it, and it must have been with their agreement, which is a real pity, because ultimately it's so obvious there that the main enemies of the left, the Labour left, but the left as a whole, was the establishment wing of the Labour Party, which was the Parliamentary Labour Party, the regional officers, and the only way to fight them was a mass movement from below. And to have destroyed the accountability, the democracy of that movement, really meant that however occasionally effective it was at elections, in terms of building a mass counterinsurgency against the establishment, which is what Jeremy and John needed more than anything, it meant that ultimately wasn't going to be an effective force for that.
There was, of course, some resistance after the coup, which established, John Lansman, either he wrote the constitution himself, but there's rumors actually his son, who's a lawyer, wrote it for him. For example, barring anybody who's been expelled from the Labour Party unjustly or justly from membership of Momentum. And there were some struggles locally. I mean, in Sheffield, there was a struggle that lasted 2 years. In other branches, it did last a long time. So there was still life there, wasn't there, Jackie?
Yeah, there was, but of course, you know, Momentum, and this is the issue of where the power with Momentum lay. Momentum, Lansman's Momentum had the database, and the database was the power, and the database had been held by John McDonnell, and the only way that Lansman could have got it within his power to control it and then put it within that constitution, which, as far as we know, appears to have been done by a relative of Lansman, was that, you know, John McDonnell allowed that to happen. And without that database to start that all up again, you know, that was a major obstacle for us.
Let's turn to the hottest potato of the whole Momentum years, and that's the anti-Semitism smear campaign. And a lot of us have been expelled over it. And I mentioned this concretely because we've heard Shonali in that clip speaking out about how they've helped people, etc. She did actually mention, and credit to her, unjustly suspended members. I think she didn't mention expelled members. And today, some of you who are still on the Momentum database will have received an email, and I just quickly quote from that. Dear Tina, the publication of the Ford report has exposed what we all knew. The Labour right have abused their power, etc., etc. Momentum won't stand idly by as comrades are expelled. That's why we're running a free advice service which can help you through the appeals process. If you've been unjustly suspended, let us know by filling in this form. So they understand there have been expulsions, unfairly expulsions, but it seems they're not going to try to appeal them. Graham, what do you think about that?
I think it's disastrous. I think the anti-Semitism witch hunt couldn't have happened on the scale that it did without the agreement or collusion of sections of the Labour left itself. I'm quite convinced of that. I'm not saying it was the decisive reason for Jeremy's ultimate demise, but I think the amount of collateral damage that was allowed really, really weakened us. In my own case, 53 years a member, in effect expelled for anti-Semitism because I signed a petition criticising the Board of Deputies of British Jews. The disproportionate number of Mike CUSHMAN will go into this, I'm sure, of JVL members disciplined for anti-Semitism. I mean, it really confuses two fundamental issues of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and it's actually unforgivable for sections of the Labour left to have colluded with that and to, in fact, lined up with the interests of a settler colonial apartheid state of Israel. And as an anti-Zionist Jew, I find that the most despicable thing of all. And there were sections of the left who colluded with it or wanted it to go away. I remember when Ken Livingstone resigned, there was one or two of my close comrades in briefing, actually, not now, but who said, well, that's a relief because that issue is now dead. As if it was. The next week, Margaret Hodge began a vicious attack on the left, and of course it wasn't dead. So it's actually an unforgivable error, and comrades who were involved in that really ought to have known better.
The right clearly tasted blood, especially around the Ken Livingstone issue. And in that longer interview with Owen Jones and John Lansman, he does talk about how proud he is, John Lansman, that he took that very seriously. And Jackie, the quote actually shows the confusion that exists in the minds, not just of John Lansman, clearly, where he's talking about criticizing Israel is anti-Semitism.
Yeah, I mean, what you've got to understand, and I think this is yet a story to be properly and fully told, is that John Lansman was talking to Jeremy Newmark, who was then the chair of the Jewish Labour movement, every single week. He was having long and detailed conversations with him. He was having as long and detailed conversations with Jeremy Newmark as he was with the leader's office. And he had this belief that somehow, if he just showed how cooperative he was being, that at some point the Jewish Labour movement would go, well, okay, Jeremy's giving it a good shot. And this happened, but it also happened because by time John Lansman became chair of Momentum, he was, I know he never wanted to call it by that name, but he was somebody who was a Zionist. And I think he absolutely associated himself with that trend of belief and believed fundamentally that you can't actually be properly Jewish and reject the state of Israel as a Jewish state.
I think John Lansman has described himself as a Zionist for a long time, but I think for many Jews it never mattered much, but it started to matter very much in the Labour Party. Okay, Graham, you disagree?
No, I just find it I find it very painful because I've known John certainly since the 80s, early 80s, when he was part of the Ben campaign. Never come across any suspect, from my point of view, suspect views on Zionism at all. And I think it would be wrong to think he was always like that. Even at the moment that Jeremy was elected leader, I was at that conference, which was a magnificent event, and we were cheering and shouting and like a bit of a rabble. And then I saw him, as we came out of that conference, I saw in a corner John Lansman, all alone, tears down his eyes, tears of joy, no doubt. And this was genuine. This was someone who he was a leading member of CLPD. He was once said, "Are you a Benite?" And he said, "No, I'm a Derrite, supporter of Vladimir Derra, a really key person in the campaign for Labour Party democracy." And he was a genuine Labour left.
And yet,
he went over.
And yet, Lansman was the first person to try and get rid of Jeremy and to replace him. He was one of the first people on the left who manoeuvred to do that. And he did that while he was chair of Momentum.
And I can confirm that.
So you have to expand on that a little bit. He tried to get rid of Jeremy Corbyn.
I made this public at the time. He phoned me up probably after a year and said, "Oh, Jeremy's a hopeless organiser. What do you think about replacing him with John McDonnell?" And I thought, oh my God, I thought this is serious. And I said, "Well, have you spoken to John McDonnell?" And he said, "Yes." I said, "Well, what did John McDonnell say?" He told me to fuck off, to John McDonnell's credit. And we never heard any more of it. But I mean, clearly he saw himself as some kind of kingmaker.
That was before the chicken coup. Graham, when was this? When was this? Can you explain that? Because a lot of people in the audience have never heard this. So can you explain this?
Probably a year into Jeremy's leadership, before the attempted chicken coup. I don't think this was even a left-right thing. I actually think he thought that Jeremy wasn't an effective leader. This was before the 2017 election, where he put on a brilliant show. And he wanted to replace him with someone he saw as more effective. And John McDonnell, to his credit, told him where to get off, and it never got off the ground.
You see, John never understood the whole Corbyn phenomenon. It was outside of his political worldview about how things were. Can we say the last names, please? There's a lot of Johns. There's John McDonnell and John Lansman. Yeah. It was out of his worldview about how things work, John Lansman. He did not understand the Corbyn phenomenon, and therefore he didn't know how to harness it. He didn't know how to build it. I mean, I always remember I was sent out to local groups. I mean, some people may have met me there, and it was my job to kind of get people to join. And I did that, and I did that pretty effectively, actually. But the problem was, whenever John Lansman went out, people would end up resigning or complaining. He had no idea about how to deal with people. He had no idea where the hunger for Corbynism was coming from. Absolutely none whatsoever. And the level to which this man is responsible for what happened to not just Corbyn, let's forget Corbyn, let's not particularize it, but the left has yet to be properly assessed and properly measured. I'm not blaming it all on him, but he was absolutely pivotal. And the Jewish Labour movement were extremely good at grooming John Lansman to do what he did, in my opinion.
What do you mean by grooming? What did they do?
Well, these conversations which would insinuate and suggest that if only this happened, if only this person were expelled, if only this was undertaken, if only the EHRC, if only Jeremy apologized again and again and again. Whereas, of course, what they knew, because they have experience of this that happens all over the world, and what we knew is the more you apologize to these people, the worse it becomes. But Lansman was there, and he was trying to see himself as the person who could bring together Zionism and the left, that he would be the person to knit those two ideologies together, which of course he did not see as incompatible. And of course, it is incompatible. You can't have a settler colonial, ethnic supremacist movement being part of a socialist one. And that's why people all around that time, like Bastani and all of those journalists around at the time of Momentum, were so mistaken. And some of them have kind of ridden back a bit on that now, but not all.
No, it's still going on, isn't it? I mean, the witch hunt is far from finished, as we've seen. I mean, we're still getting messages from people, which is why it's so important to stand up for expelled members as well. You have any association with any of the proscribed groups, liking a Facebook page once, that would get you expelled these days. And that's the kind of thing that we should be fighting against, and not just the suspended. Jackie, there was some attempt to rescue Momentum, or to build an alternative structure around the existing Momentum. That never really took off, though, did it? Grassroots Momentum, what happened there?
Well, I think a mixture of things happened. Again, it was an issue of capacity. There's always an issue of capacity when you've got this, Momentum holding both so much money and so much data. But you also had, the activities of the Alliance for Workers' Liberty, poisonous so-called left-wing Zionist group who were there, and it was impossible to work with them.
And I think there was a refusal, I think, to oppose the witch hunt. I think is the main issue. That's
absolutely. And some of us, many of us who are here, understood that was the pivotal issue for the left, and it still remains the pivotal issue for the left.
I agree. Graham, any final words before I bring in Mike CUSHMAN?
Yeah, two things. On the Grassroots and Momentum, it failed because we were fighting the brand and because we were not united. We consisted of really good people like Matt Rack, his brother Nick Rack, and me, Jackie, and others. And a very substantial minority of that committee that was set up was AWL, and there just wasn't the political agreement. But just two quick points I would just want to add. That what happened in Momentum was only part of the problems the whole left faced at the time. And it also reflected the weakness of the movement from below. Because if the movement from below had been really strong, then perhaps we would have been able to put these people in their place. And they weren't put in their place, partly because of our weakness.
I mean, Corbyn was an accident, isn't it? We've said it before. He was elected despite the fact that the left was as weak as almost never before. Stronger than it is now, for sure. But, it certainly wasn't in a huge fighting mode, etc. But it was quite sad. We did all of us were engaged in a lot of stall and publicity activity, no doubt, with Momentum, and it was overwhelming. You put up a stall and people flocked to you and wanted to get involved, young people especially. Not anything since. What a crime to waste that energy.
It's a tragedy. It's not just a tragedy in terms of wasting that energy, but it's a tragedy because actually its destruction and the way it was destroyed. And now I'm not saying that I actually think it would have all worked out and panned out fine, but the way that it was destroyed has opened us up now to the most right-wing Labour and Tory forces that there are.
Yep. And we will be suffering the consequences for some time. There is, of course, signs of a fight back, and this is fantastic. But in terms of the organized left, we are struggling, and this is the fallout from the defeat of the Corbyn movement and the defeat of Momentum as a useful and effective organization is part of that. We will be talking about this with other comrades. There have been, there was some hope that Momentum organizers who've just taken over half the leadership would make a difference, and we're going to talk to this now with Mike CUSHMAN. Hello from the JVL, Jewish Voice for Labour. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Gina.
Hiya. Graham just said, the witch hunt, or Jackie said it. I think the witch hunt is and was the pivotal issue. And yet, when it comes to the NEC elections just going on, that doesn't seem to be a huge pledges are being asked of candidates. Instead, Naomi Wimborne Idrissi has been asked to sign a pledge for self-ID of transgender people. And because she didn't want to sign that, Momentum refused to support her. Did I get that right? Is that
well,
what happened?
It's a more interesting story than that.
Oh, go on.
I mean, I defer to Jackie and Graham's knowledge about the workings of Momentum. I was briefly a member and never really got engaged with them and quit quite early on. But in terms of Naomi's candidature, I mean, this had been discussed with the other left groups from the end of last year. And Momentum were always hesitant about, well, opposed to supporting Naomi. And one tried to find out why. You could never get an answer from them. There's a lot of attempts to reach out, both by JVL and by the other organised groups of Centre-Left Grassroots Alliance, CLGA, the coordinating group for elections, to try to find out why they were so opposed to Naomi when every other group was strongly in support of her. And they never came up with any sensible answer. They never came up with any answer at all. They just said, no, we're not having her. They never mentioned trans rights. They never mentioned self-ID until they went through this not saying. Then they tried to say, oh, well, we only want 4 people, not 5. On the slate for some rather arcane and highly inaccurate arithmetic reasoning that got roundly derided. And then it came that there was a push from a number of people from the Momentum organisers group who were new to the NCG to support Naomi, supported by a number of the affiliate organisations that had reps on the NCG. And there was, 10 days ago, a vote to back Naomi, at which point people went apeshit. And suddenly there was demand that Naomi sign a statement. Now, whether the statement was good or bad was not initially the problem. What we have is a coalition of 13 groups. And what people sign up to is the positions of the large coalition, not what individuals are signing up to because of what other groups ask. I mean, there's been a demand that people sign up for proportional representation. Now, lots of us are in favor of PR. But because this wasn't an agreed position of CLGA, it wasn't a CLGA statement, no one was signing it up to it. We then get this rather strange statement from Momentum saying, sign here within the next 48 hours or we're not backing you. Now, this statement demanded support for self-ID because they claimed Naomi had a history of transphobia. There is no history of transphobia.
Can I ask you, Mike, was that statement just put to Naomi or to all?
Yes, just to Naomi.
Oh, wow.
Because they tried to do guilt by association. She had been in a meeting with someone that they then disliked, and therefore she had to prove her innocence. That was bad enough.
Sounds like a witch hunt, doesn't it? It sounds just like the tactics of the right and the witch hunt.
Yeah. But worse than that, it listed a number of equalities issues. It didn't list anti-Semitism, and it didn't list Islamophobia. Now, asking a Jewish person to sign up to a list of equalities issues that didn't include anti-Semitism was madness. For a member of JVL to do that was inviting them to commit political suicide. The document was framed so it was impossible to sign. And there have been a number of other things going on in the background. I got a letter from someone who wanted to stand for the NCG, who was being vetted before they could stand for the NCG. And they had a charge sheet that looked exactly like what comes out of the Labour Party. It was all guilt by association and prove that you are innocent of these allegations that were not explaining. It was as though there are people inside the Momentum organisation who are auditioning for jobs in the GLU. It was exactly like that. So I worked with him on a possible response. In fact, he didn't get enough nominations, so his name was not going forward, so it was dropped. But I was absolutely horrified. But of course, this goes into a long history where I think the centre of gravity of Momentum from Lansman onwards is liberal Zionism. It's not that they don't have real and serious criticisms of the behaviour of the State of Israel. They're not mad, they're not inhuman, they can see there is oppression. But what they believe is that these are aberrations and not embedded into the whole nature of the way the state was set up. And that's the difference between people like JVL and people like Momentum, that we see what Israel is doing not as aberrations, but as inherent in the way the state was set up. And because of Lansman Zionism, the residual influence of AWL, who are willing to do deals with the most extreme right-wing parts of the Labour Party in order to support Israel. So I've been in meetings where they've been there together with leaders of the right wing of the Labour Party and a supposedly sub-Trotskyist group singing in harmony. It's an extraordinary experience. And that's where Momentum come from. Now, I'm not saying Momentum's not done good work in the past. They did energize a lot of young people. They did really good work in the 2017 election in particular, and to a lesser extent in the 2019 general election, to get people onto the streets, knocking on doors. And I won't go and say that, they did good work. But they've let all that good work dissipate. I mean, in Lambeth and Streatham, we disassociated ourselves from Momentum many years ago and set ourselves up as Streatham Labour Left. Momentum gave us help when we were trying to get Bel Ribeiro Adi selected, and they let us use their database because we still had a residual connection to them. Even in 2019, this wonderful database that everyone praises was full of errors, people who no longer live where they were meant to live, people who are no longer members of the Labour Party, people who seem to have no political connection with Momentum. And so even 3 years ago, this great resource that was meant to empower the left, that was Momentum's claim to have a biggest seat at the table, was a fast declining resource. Now, where we have people, the Labour right are going to say the left is split, there are two slates. There is not, there's one slate for the NEC, which is a slate of 5 people of whom Momentum are supporting 4. There is no separate slate, there is just a slate where Momentum, for their factional reasons, are only supporting 4.
Yeah. Mike, can I ask you about this Naomi situation? Do you think that somebody put the issue of self-ID to Momentum in order, as a fig leaf to get rid of Naomi? And how did the Momentum organizers change? Did that change their attitude to Naomi, to your knowledge?
Well, they split 50-50, so there were half as many votes for Naomi at the second time round as the first time round.
Right.
And there were people from MO who were furious. I mean, when I spoke to them later, they were virtually in tears. Now, the internal workings of Momentum are a mystery to everybody. They're more mysterious than the internal workings of Southside. But there are people in Momentum who are very firmly committed to a self-ID stance. I mean, that's a genuinely held view of theirs. I'm not denying that. But this is lined up with this determination not to have anyone from JVL ever stand for anything inside the Labour Party. We got Stephen Marks coming on later, who will tell you how Momentum tried to knife him when he was standing for the NCC, the National
Constitutional Committee, yes.
Constitutional Committee.
Yeah, we'll talk to him.
That when Pete Wilsman was knifed, John Lansman dropped him from the Grassroots 9. Now, JVL got itself into a lot of trouble for saying there was a slate of 9. We are going to call for votes for John Lansman because that was the CLGA stance. And we said, we are part of a coalition. We do not break coalitions, no matter how badly the other people behave. And we said, vote for the Grassroots 9, not just 8.
Yes.
Don't drop Lansman, don't drop Wilson, vote for the whole 9, because that's the only principled way to go. And what Momentum are trying to do is say they don't understand coalition building. Coalition is aligning yourself with the things you agree on, not finding the areas of difference in order to split. That's the old Trotskyist line that we've suffered from in this country since I was a very much younger person.
It certainly seems to me that it would be good to have a principled position, or necessary for any candidates to have a principled position on the witch hunt, etc., or on support for Palestine, etc.
I mean, but
subject like the Brand's issue.
Don't have a principled position on the witch hunt.
Yes.
When people go to them for advice, their default position is apologize. Apologize to try to get let back in, not say these accusations are ill-founded. They are, when have you stopped beating your spouse type questions? There's questions for self-incrimination. They invite people to self-incriminate, to apologize for things that they should not apologize for because they've done nothing wrong.
Thank you, Mike. We're going to bring in Steve Price now to talk about this issue a bit more. Steve is hi, Steve. He's a member of the CLPD, and we should actually say out these names because not everybody knows this all by heart. There's the Campaign for Labour Party Democracy that John Lansman was involved in, etc. And the CLPD is one of the leading organizations in the Centre-Left Grassroots Alliance, the CLGA, which Mike touched upon. 13 groups involved in that, Steve, I understand. Why, do you think it has, I mean, it wasn't the CLGA that picked on this self-ID issue, is it?
No.
Sorry, Mike, you're waving. Are you okay?
Yeah. Sorry, I forgot. I mean, one important thing I said. I know everyone on this call who is a member of the Labour Party will be voting for the Grassroots 5. I have no doubt about that. Our job is not talking to the people here. Our job is every one of us to get out into our organisations, into our CLPs, even if we've left the Labour Party, to convince the people in the middle that the Grassroots 5 are the people that we need on NEC to try to hold Evans to account and to try to stop the corruption inside our Labour Party.
Yeah. And at least
Please
Naomi
get out and don't just think you've done the job when you vote yourself. You have to get everyone else to vote the Grassroots 5 as well.
Thank you, Mike. And at least with Naomi, we know that she's standing up to the witch hunt. I'm not 100% sure about the other candidates. Thank you for joining us, Mike. Hi, Steve. So you are in the CLPD and you know a lot what's been going on behind the scenes. What are you thinking about this issue of dropping Naomi from Momentum?
Yes, Tina. I'm in. Yes, I've always been active in CLPD, but I was in Momentum for a long time. I was in Momentum very early days. I used to go into headquarters and have conversations with John Lansman and Phil, Schneider, all those people at Momentum HQ. I was for a couple of years. I was very committed to that as a project. It was quite phenomenal development, politically. It will be subject to dissertations for years to come, no doubt. But it did go wrong around the time of, clearly with the Constitution, the stuff Jackie was talking about, and then several other things happened after that, and it kind of degenerated. And my view on Momentum these days is that it's basically a shell organisation. It's They do the stuff. They put a lot of stuff out on social media. They're going for the elections, but the grassroots, for the most part, there's very little left now of momentum to what there was in the early days when there was that energy around the Corbyn momentum, as in the name momentum, which is now no momentum because there is no momentum that I see with
only 3,000 people, just over 3,000 people voted in the last NCG elections, when I think the membership was up to 50,000, I believe, or supporters.
I am in CLPD, but I'm in everything. You know, I'm also a member of the LRC. I was a member of Momentum. I rejoined when this new development came along and voted, and then I thought, nah, and I walked away from Momentum for some serious disagreements with them. But I'm also in JVL. I'm in a number of organisations. What I've always done, you know, and yes, I have worked to some extent with it from the inside, with it, you know, looking at CLGA and trying to influence developments. Perhaps I should just say a little bit about the CLJ first and who they are, because we're kind of assuming everybody knows who they are because they're a very shadowy organisation. The Centre-Left, and there's a clue in the name there, the Centre-Left Grassroots Alliance was formed during the Blair years when the left had been smashed by Blair. And the left was at a very low ebb. And the idea was to try and agree some slates to get some people on the NEC who could actually even report what was going on in the NEC, because it was so secretive that no one actually knew what was even discussed at the NEC. And it succeeded to a degree. And we got, you know, Wilsman was on there for a long time, Pete, Christine Shawcroft was on there, and Anne Black, who actually stood on the centre-left slate. I'm not sure she was ever very, very left. They were in the room and they were reporting stuff out. So it kind of succeeded to that degree.
What never happened, I think, is like they have an agreed program or anything like that. It was always a sort of dealing and wheeling, isn't it? We get this candidate, you get that one, but on what they stand for or reporting back, that was never agreed.
It was just a slate making machine. It was just waves, and you know, and we did set up a good system. It had a lot of contacts amongst the branch secretaries and in the constituencies. And it was intended to be an election machine, which of course what Momentum then kind of supplanted it, because obviously Momentum had a bigger machine. But that was the idea originally. What happened though was that once Corbyn was elected, the CLJ assumed much greater significance. Because I don't know whether people fully appreciate, but for 2 years after Corbyn was elected, it was pretty impotent, because the NEC was controlled by Tom Watson. And so he could get very little agreed through the NEC. And it wasn't until after 2017, and partly when they put more representatives onto the NEC, it went from 6 to 9, that for the first time, Corbyn actually had a kind of majority. It was a very delicate balance numerically, but he actually had an advantage. You could start to make decisions. So the CLJ became more important because it was the CLJ who were deciding who we were going to put on, who the left were going to put on the NEC, which is the governing body of the party between elections. That's what the NEC does. It has enormous power, but arguably too much power and too much unaccountable power. But I mean, that was why the CLJ suddenly became more important. And of course, it's grown and expanded since then. There are now, as you say, 13 organisations. And if people don't know, so you've got CLPD, you've got the Labour Representative Organisation Committee, you've got JVL, you've got Red Labour, Grassroots Black Left, Labour Women Leading, and of course, Momentum. And this quickly became a problem, because at its peak, as you said before, Momentum claimed, 50,000 members? 50,000 members, which absolutely dwarfed any other organisation in terms of numbers. There's probably no other organisation. No, I shouldn't say that, because JVL obviously might disagree with this, but most of them would have. Some of them would only have 100 to 200 members, and now you've got Momentum with its claimed 50,000 members. But the way that the CLJ was set up was built on consensus. Everyone in the room had to agree.
Veto, with other words, yeah, there was a veto in operation.
Well, there wasn't initially. That's the point. So initially, it had to be consensus, and they would meet and meet and meet again until there was consensus. They could meet 30 times until they got consensus. But once you've got 14 or 13, 14 organisations, it became much more difficult to achieve consensus. And of course, Momentum, particularly with John at the helm, became very frustrated with that state of affairs because they had one vote, and then a small organisation with maybe only 100 members would have one vote. And increasingly, Momentum came to see itself as the left. They're the big beast. They're the big organisation. And they started to, as you say, to apply veto within the CLGA, and then at a later stage, actually breaking ranks and saying, "I'll tell you what," when they dumped Pete Wilsman, now post Stephen Marks, who's going to speak shortly. They started to actually exercise, say, well, actually, we don't really care about this consensus stuff anymore. We're going to do this anyway.
I know there have been attempts to reform the CLGA and give weighted votes to groups, etc. But of course, things change all the time, as we've now seen in the NCG election for Momentum. Just over 3,000 people voted. Their Momentum's membership can't be much bigger than that. So that's actually close to some of the other organizations. So is there a future for CLGA if Momentum carries on with that behavior?
I think it's problematic because I think I should before I move off, I should say something about these issues that have just been raised about anti-Semitism and trans. I'll say something briefly about that in a minute, but it is problematic because clearly the consensus is, this consensus voting is breaking down repeatedly, and at what point does it become just dysfunctional and not fit for purpose? Because if Momentum are just going to say, well, actually, we don't agree with this, so we're not going to support Naomi. Or actually what happened before, which you may or may not be aware of, but they were very reluctant to support Laura Pidcock or Anne Henderson because they wanted them to sign a declaration on trans. And so there was repeated meetings trying to persuade that they actually relented in the end. But the whole pattern of, Momentum wanting to assert their rights because they're the big beast. We've got as members, So I don't know what the future is going to be, but I don't see, it doesn't look good to me because it's old politics anyway. It's smoke-filled rooms. It's people coming together with no obvious mandates. They're going to say, well, we want to support, for instance, JVL went to the meeting in 2019, wanted to support Joe Bird. And Momentum were not going to support Joe Bird. In fact, even CLPD, because they were cozying up to Momentum, were not going to support Joe Bird. So you get into this area now where this consensus has broken down, and then there's distrust, and then people start leaking, because one of the biggest crimes when you're on the CLJ is to actually tell anybody what's being discussed.
Transparency is the enemy, yes.
If you do that. And so, I think, how would it reform itself? Greater transparency, greater openness. I know candidates are selected. And there's an argument that, bringing left organisations together to agree a slate, rather than the left being completely divided and playing into the right wing. Because the right wing are never divided. They know what they're doing. They're very disciplined in what they do. Yeah.
And it seems a program, a basic minimum program for those candidates who, often didn't stand up to the witch hunt on the NEC either, and never did any, publicity or publicly reporting about what's going on, etc. There seems to be some basic general agreements that should be implemented in such a candidate selection process, for sure.
With that, and the issues that are causing the undersurfaced issues that have caused the breakdown, apart from this power, this what is seen as a power imbalance by Momentum, who frankly are quite arrogant. They do actually see themselves as we're the big beast. Don't we? Some of these Mickey Mouse organisations. That's some of the attitude that's there, I'm afraid. The key issues that have been breaking points have been anti-Semitism repeatedly, which Momentum's had a terrible position on consistently, whatever anybody says, and now trans rights. I'm told that they see their demographic as young metrosexual, and they don't want to offend that demographic, whatever that means. What the hell is that? And I'm pro-trans. Don't misunderstand me. I'm actually very militant supportive of trans. But you want to break everything down over that. You're going to you someone like Naomi, you're going to chuck Naomi off because of a transition. If we believe that, which we probably don't.
Yeah, it also splits the whole left down the middle, of course, and there are so many grey areas around the issue of trans and self-ID. I think to demand that you have to come out either way, otherwise we won't support you, is madness. Where, when you say nothing about anti-Semitism, the witch hunt, or support for Palestine, opposition to what Israel is doing, silence on that is apparently okay, but you must take a position on that issue seems absolute madness. We want to bring in Stephen Marks now to discuss that. Thank you, Steve. Hi, Stephen. So you were actually a candidate. You stood for the National Constitutional Committee, and
I'm still on it until conference, but I'm suspended. I don't disagree with most of what's been said, but I do find it quite incredible that we can have this inward-looking, private conversation about far-left sectarian trivia at a time when there's a mass strike wave going on throughout the country. We've heard that Sharon Graham, Dave Ward, and Mick Lynch has issued a joint statement calling for simultaneous strike action. Felix Stowe Dockers have voted to strike by 92%. And that opportunist Lisa Nandy has been on manoeuvres going around picket lines. Steve, and I think, please don't interrupt me. I think it's very important that everything we're discussing here certainly should be discussed, but it's meaningless if it isn't discussed in the framework of how we intervene into this mass strike wave, which unfortunately is only happening now. If it had happened at the same time that Jeremy was elected, then as we can all agree, the Jeremy movement, whether Jeremy would have had some steam in his pistons.
The reason we're discussing Momentum is, of course, that if we had a democratic, transparent organization of the left, if Momentum hadn't been corrupted, that would be the kind of organization that could intervene in a strike.
Yes, but it's very important to understand what that doesn't mean that we're powerless. And in many parts of the country, including in Oxford, where I am, Momentum goes under the name of Oxfordshire Left Network, or whatever it is. It's basically, most of them are probably members of Momentum, some are not. We do what we want. If Momentum takes a national initiative, we support it. And if it says something silly, we ignore it. And we go ahead. Meanwhile, the really important thing we should be discussing is how we intervene in this present situation. In Oxford, we had a trades council meeting with leading local trade unionists on the platform. We got the local Labour Party executive, on which we have a majority, to agree to send out a message to all Labour Party members, telling them to turn up on the picket line and calling on our MP, Annalisa, to join them.
We did discuss this issue last week. I don't know if you listened to our show last week. We had that issue as the main.
Very good, excellent. And
this week we wanted to talk about Momentum because
I'm coming on to that, but I think we have to put it in the right framework. And we've also decided to hold an all members meeting on the Ford report and to invite Chakrabarti to speak to it. Now, on the question of Momentum, I know, as you hinted, that they have always had the Momentum bureaucracy. No, it's rather like the Labour Party. You've got a full-time apparatus who are a faction in themselves, and they do what they want, regardless of what the elected leadership want, or they can do. And when I was on the slate 4 years ago for election to the National Constitutional Committee, Lansman himself, at a meeting I was at, point blank refused to have me on it because I was in JVL. I mean, it was quite explicit that that was the reason. And in the end, And he even said that Jeremy agreed with him, which turned out to be a lie, because we had a meeting in a pub organised by Jeremy's local Labour councillor, and Lara Alvarez turned up and gave her our full solidarity. And Jeremy made clear privately that he did not agree with this veto on me. And there was something of a revolt among the within the staff of Momentum. Certainly somebody we know was leading a revolt, and in the end I was backed. So I have no illusions whatsoever about Momentum, but I wouldn't lump the whole of Momentum in with a permanent faction of its staff, any more than I'd wipe out the whole membership of the Labour Party for the same reason.
So do you have hope that Momentum can still be turned around and come out against?
No, quite possibly not. But there are all sorts of things we can and should be doing. In effect, what we need is to think in terms of local councils of action made up of whoever there is in the locality you can get to support it. The local Labour Party, if you can get them to do it, the Trades Council, local trade union branches that are taking action. The composition will be different in different places, and get, for example, Oxford Trades Council produced an excellent leaflet. Hang on, I've got a copy of it, saying support your local strikes, and a list of the dates of the different strikes. We held a meeting where the local TSSA branch secretary, oh, this is it, the local TSSA branch secretary spoke, and he's been expelled.
Lots of stuff like that is happening. Unfortunately, I can't see Momentum much getting involved in that. What in your assessment, where do you think did things go wrong with Momentum? Where could it have turned around? What do we have to do better next time if we're having another chance of building something like that?
Well, more democracy and accountability. But the situation is too diverse simply to write off Momentum. And where there are excellent local Momentum groups, which there are, my experience is that they do what they think needs doing, and are not terribly interested in what goes on at National Momentum, which no doubt is wrong of them. But to say only 3,000 people voted, I don't have the figures for previous Momentum elections, but it was always massively below the membership. And I think that tells you something about Momentum, that it had a largely paper membership compared to something like the CLPD, which had a more active, much smaller, more selective, if you like, membership of local activists. So that's where I'm coming from.
Thanks, Stephen. Do you think you're going to be expelled, or do you have hope that you might?
Well, I've been suspended for more than a year. So, and this was in spite of massive letters in my support from people in the Oxford Party who know me and who are in no way, alas, Corbynites, but who simply couldn't believe that, I was actually suspended for having signed various statements, which were signed by hundreds of other people, including Noam Chomsky, in the case of one of them. And why I was singled out, well, we all know why. Obviously, they were going through a list of people that actually, I went on a training, an anti-Semitism training course organised by the JLM that was put on specially for people on the NEC and NCC and other Labour committees before it was rolled out to the membership. And I made what I thought was a very mild intervention, praising some bits of it, but also pointing out that the JLM is actually affiliated to the World Zionist Organization, whose settlement division helps finance illegal settlements, contrary to Labour Party policy and international law, and therefore said if you join that organisation, a very small part of your subscription goes to building illegal settlements in the West Bank. And who was it? One of the top honchos in JLM was it Mike Katz or Peter Mason? He went absolutely ballistic. I couldn't believe it. It was absolutely, that is outrageous. How dare, blah, blah, blah. And then said I was someone who was facilitating anti-Semitism. And a fortnight later, I was suspended. Maybe a complete coincidence. But
thank you very much for joining us, Stephen. I hope well, I'm not sure your suspension has any chance of being overturned in this current climate, but thank you very much for joining us. We're going to speak to Carlos now, who is from Barnet Momentum. Hello. And has asked to be introduced as a former supporter of Momentum organizer. And that intrigued us because you had some hopes that Momentum might be turned around with Momentum organizers having secured almost 50% of the vote. Not so? What do you think?
What can I say? I'm disappointed. I've been told that it's too early to pass a judgment, to give them a chance. But what does giving them a chance mean? You know, waiting a whole 2 years of their term to see what they do. There were hopes that a win for Momentum organizers will mean Momentum finally joining other left-wing organizations to defend the left inside the Labour Party. This was central to what Momentum organizers were saying they were going to do. And they were meant to also not block Jewish socialist candidates, specifically, let's name them, those proposed by JVL, which has already been said. There has been many instances of people being blocked. Now, within our local group in Barnet Momentum, we had people claiming this ridiculous arithmetic justification for backing only 4 candidates to the NEC, and people saying that they were going to vote a mix of your Momentum and Momentum organizers for the NCG at the last election a few weeks ago. And something very interesting happened when Momentum dropped Naomi for second time, really, is that all those people who have said that Momentum had actually been doing a good job and that we should support the continuity of forward momentum, which was your Momentum, or at least some of them, some of their candidates, many of them actually got behind Naomi because we know Naomi in Barnet. I mean, you know, she's like family to us. And she has come along to our meetings. People know what she stands for. Naomi has a very strong reputation, second to none, I would say, as an activist, as somebody who opposes all injustices and oppression. JVL came out with a clear statement, basically saying that Naomi holds no transphobic views, and yet the vote on the NCG went against it. So what we thought in our local group is, and this was without opposition, it was totally instant. I mean, the moment we knew that the NCG had met for a second time and they had decided to reverse an initial vote after Momentum organizers met, people started emailing their support for the Grassroots 5 and Naomi. Even people who, including people who support, unequivocally speaking, who support self-ID. So
do you think that has been a fig leaf, that issue of self-ID? Was it has it been moved as a way to get rid of her? Because of
I have to wonder. As it has been said before, one of the main issues that we face on the left are exclusions, suspension, unfair suspensions and exclusions. Yet Momentum seems to think that there is one single issue that they have to demand all candidates to sign up to, when the issue itself, let's be clear, the issue itself of self-ID, whatever you think about it, I'm not going to go into the debate for or against self-ID, but let's be clear that this issue has never been agreed by Momentum as an organization. The membership of Momentum has never been consulted on self-ID.
That's a very good point, yes.
Yet, you know, they expect, they demand candidates to sign up to it. Now, there was a very clear, sorry, I have the motion open up here, hold on. There was a very clear paragraph in Momentum Organizers' manifesto, and it was called a manifesto. It was very detailed, despite your Momentum alleging that Momentum Organizers have no clear, detailed policies. Momentum Organizers did, and they had pledged that they will stop dictating other left organizations what to do at the CLG negotiations at the table. So I don't know if I can share my screen maybe and show this to you.
Try it. Yeah, try now.
Where is it? The share screen option?
At the bottom of the screen, it should be.
Share screen.
Can you see it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm usually behind the camera. I don't like being in front of the camera, but okay. So this is our motion. Can you see it? Or?
Yes, yes.
Clearly? Okay. So the first part is clearly it's just a simple way of explaining what the motion is about. But the main point here was that we wanted to ask, you know, why was a second meeting called? After the NCG met for the first time after the NCG elections, the vote to endorse the Grassroots 5, and including Naomi, was overwhelmingly in favor. There was no evidence produced for the co-chairs to call for a second meeting. I mean, you know, on an initial statement by Momentum, they tried to claim that there was a question mark about Naomi's supposedly not being, hold on, what words did they use? I don't want to misquote them. That they were basically claiming that Naomi has not made her position clear on transphobia. But there was no evidence produced that will indicate that Naomi actually held transphobic views. I mean, if you're going to call an emergency meeting to overturn a decision that has been passed overwhelmingly, like only days before, surely you need a very strong case to do so. Otherwise, you're wasting people's time. So what happened? Yeah, this is what we want to know. And, you know, there is already in the public domain, the suggestion that maybe there were people who were not inside the elected in the NCG who actually put pressure on the co-chairs to call a second meeting. Is this correct? Did this happen? If this happened, it will be highly undemocratic, and the membership has a right to know about this. Absolutely. In fact, I think the full story is even worse than this. The exact details may actually eventually leak out after the NEC elections are over. But failing a full explanation of why the second meeting was called, then there was no reason to have that meeting, and the grassroots the first decision to support the Grassroots 5, and Naomi should stand. So my point is that, you know, we will support the Grassroots 5 in my local group. I don't know if we will continue existing as a Momentum affiliate after our next AGM, but we will vote in accordance to the link that I just posted on the chat, which allows you to write in your postcode, and CLPD has set it up so the recommendations of in terms of the order of preferences will be known according to.
Thank you very much, Carlos, for coming on. I think you made a really good point there that actually Momentum doesn't have a position on this. So certainly the Momentum members made no decision on this issue, and it's good to see that Momentum branches are, you know, not all Momentum branches are fighting. Supporting this, and there are some branches that are still active. There are not that many branches left, but the ones that seem active seem to be opposing this. So thank you for explaining this, and also thank you for explaining how you changed your mind. I think this is incredibly important that people are able to change their mind and talk openly about it. Thank you for joining us, Carlos. We have another member from a local Momentum branch, who's John Brazendale. Hi, thanks for joining us. Who's Momentum Bradford, I believe. Sorry, I think I've just muted you again. Sorry, if you could just unmute yourself. Is your branch doing anything about this Naomi situation?
As far as I know, no. But yeah, I was just wanting to talk about our situation as a branch, because I think historically, as a Momentum branch, we've been one of the largest in the north, yet we've kind of been treated as outsiders, despite being like having the largest membership, which is active.
How are you being treated as outsiders? What do you mean? They ignored you?
So, from what I know, because I know quite a few people in Leeds, so I was a student in Leeds before moving away, but what we know is John Lansman used to visit their branch quite regularly during the Corbyn years, and a lot of the people who sort of got involved with Momentum organisers and Momentum Renewal, they are people who are kind of connected to people in Leeds, and it's kind of treated as a network of people who, I think from the start, well, I think John Lansman just wanted token Northerners, and he just went to the largest cities. He had no interest in coming to where the membership is, or
I think that's kind of related to he wasn't very interested in building actual functioning branches that have their own life, as Jackie was explaining earlier. Do you still have branch meetings? Are there how many people show up to a branch meeting?
Yeah, so I'd say typically about 8 members at the moment, so it's not as big as it used to. So it used to be about 20 before all this happened, and yeah. But we were quite supportive of Forward Momentum because they got in touch with us originally, and we supported our secretary, Aline Bashir, who is now on the NDC as your Momentum candidate. And he's been reporting back what's been happening, and it does, what we've been told is Momentum organisers have been organising as a single group, whereas they, on agenda items, they all put their hand up on the same thing to speak all at once, really just to shut out any other voices, and they don't seem to be wanting to work with anyone outside the faction.
And do you think the your Momentum lot are not acting as a faction?
Well, I imagine to some extent, yes, but they're not organised in the same way as your Momentum, and I do see it as a continuation of some of the people.
Are you happy then? I mean, are you happy with the way Momentum is going, or do you have criticism along the lines of what you've heard tonight?
So, like Momentum, I'd say Well, I just don't know what it's supposed to be anymore, really. So
yeah, I think they're looking for a new identity, aren't they, for sure, with the Corbyn stuff gone. Thank you very much for joining us, John. We've got another person, a local member, who is Sandra Wyman, wanted to speak about her experience. Hello, Sandra. You are, I think, a Momentum member in Leeds. Is that right?
I was I was a Momentum member for a short while. I was very impressed around the time Jeremy got elected and after with what Momentum was doing. It seemed to have a lot of life to it, a lot of places it was going, and then it all got sour. And I think what happened to Jackie was kind of a very important stage in how I viewed Momentum. I had a number of issues with people locally. Now, I'm told that they weren't actually Momentum leaders, but they actually acted as such. And I will say, I do also know a number of people who I think are absolutely brilliant left-wing socialists, very good comrades who happen to be Momentum members. So I was sort of influenced by that as well. But it started going sour. It started going very sour. And at the same time, as a grassroots member, I found that I was being ordered to do things. I don't take very nicely to that. I've been around for a long time, and I am fairly independent thinking. I will quite happily vote on slates that have been agreed, and I'll act responsibly in that way. But I don't like being told what to do and what to think and what to consider important without any explanation. You must do this, you must do that, with no explanation given. And that was happening all the time. There was also the fact that the membership fee is quite high. And I wouldn't pay, if I pay 96 quid a year for an organisation, I want to be able to get something out of it. And that wasn't happening either. And all the time, you know, things were going to improve, and there was new local leadership and it was going to improve. And then a couple of years later, it was going to improve again. So it seemed like it wasn't getting anywhere. The other big issue for me was Momentum's lack of commitment, and it's particularly opposite in what's happening to Naomi, lack of commitment to equalities. I have a friend who was the equalities officer, I think they call it something else, who actually is now in despair because of the lack of support she gets from the Momentum hierarchy. In my own case, I'm disabled, and one of the groups I joined was, I can't remember what it's called, I think it's called Momentum Disability or something, had a Facebook page, signed up to it, nothing happened. There's a Momentum group dominates the left groups in Leeds still. There's a Facebook page, which is Labour Left, Leeds Labour Left. I tried to actually post things about DPAC, of which I'm a member, that's Disabled People Against Cuts, which is a campaigning organisation. Things about the social model, which is a socialist model, because it defines the oppression of disabled people as coming about because of capitalism. And that's very important to me. Every time I did it, I was told categorically, disability is not an issue for the left. And that
is clearly a problem.
That was actually very, very important. I needed to feel validated and supported, and that they didn't support me in that way.
And you left Momentum a while ago then, did you?
Sorry?
You left Momentum then after your experiences?
No, I left Momentum when I tried, well, I left Momentum once and then rejoined briefly because they'd said they'd improved, and there was this friend who was actually working on equalities, but then there just didn't seem to be anything happening, you know. And the only things I ever got were things telling me what to do. And the most recent thing asking me how I identified in language that was actually ableist. And that was just a total misunderstanding, you know, of what disability politics is about, after 50 years of there being a different, you know, socialist view of disability. I didn't see Momentum actually supporting other people either. There is a separate Black Momentum, which I think is a separate organisation, which does, but it's not part of regular Momentum, at least not locally.
Thank you, Sandra. It's I think there's a few issues we've just identified there as being a problem with Momentum. I wanted to bring out two speakers from the beginning back, Jackie and Graham, to discuss briefly. I mean, we did set out this meeting. We didn't set it out to bash Momentum or to bash Corbyn, but there has been a few issues happening there recently that we thought was important to discuss, and I think it's been quite eye-opening what happened with Naomi, and we would urge our audience to vote for her in the NEC elections if you are still a member of the Labour Party. But say, if we could turn back time, 2015, if we could, you know, build a organisation that is effective and democratic, how could it have done better? Or put another way, how would we do it better the next time? Because the left is in dire straits now. How can we rebuild? What are the lessons that we have to learn from the failure of Momentum and the defeat of Corbyn movement? How can we do it better? I'll start with you, Graham.
I think Stephen Marks put his finger on it, really. We're in the middle of a strike wave, and I think now the epicentre of struggle is in the trade unions rather than the Labour Party, which doesn't mean at all that I've written off the Labour Party, but the only way we are going now to affect the Labour Party, if we can, is to build that movement from below. And what Stephen said, and he touched upon issues we discussed in the last two programmes, is to link up with this resistance, build it. What Mick Lynch said was crucial. Plant the banner of trade unionism in every community, and through that put pressure on the Labour Party to see if it is capable of responding. And what we've seen in the last week or so with Santari and all of this is something more important even than programmatic difference. It's the whole character of the Labour Party that is at stake. Its link with the trade unions. And if the left has any role at all, it is to engage in that. That's why I treat those who just write off the Labour Party, saying it's already dead, as having a rather shallow analysis. We've got to build that resistance. And if we can look outwards, and that's the critical thing, I think ultimately that Momentum failed on, was to fail to build an independent grassroots organisation that looked outward to those in struggle. And especially now the irony is, of course, and as Stephen and in fact others pointed out in the last programme, the contradiction between the quiescence of the trade union movement when Corbyn was leader, God was it needed then, and now the beginnings of a resurgence of the trade union movement in a situation where the Labour Party is for the foreseeable future unusable. And we've got a problem here, and we've got to begin to resolve it. And that's the role of the left, to learn the lessons of there's something else as well, is to be strong when it really matters on fundamental issues of which affect socialists. The red line, if you like, the red line of standing up to all forms of racism without a hierarchy, to standing up against apartheid Israel, to standing up against the witch hunt, and above all, through that political strength, to link up with the trade unions in our communities, and ultimately either to rebuild in the Labour Party if we may, or build a new party of Labour if we must. But that's the lesson, I think, that we must learn going forwards.
Jackie, what do you think?
I don't think it's very complicated, really, because all the best local Momentum groups did basically do what they want locally, and they were locally organised, and that's where it has to be. and whether at the moment it's with the trades union, in 6 months' time, in a year's time, it could be somewhere else. So we've just got to be looking at what's happening both nationally and locally, and be trying to build up local groups. I mean, one of the issues, of course, was what Corbyn gave us was that national visibility. And he was sort of riding on a zeitgeist. People were totally fed up with what was going on. And so if you were trying to build groups, which, you know, we were, I was, Graham was, I'm sure you were up in Sheffield, you had, like you said, an open goal. You had a willing audience. That time hasn't passed. That time will come again. When, whether or not we have Starmer or we have the Tories in the next government, is almost, we're still going to be faced with the fact that both of them are really going to be cutting local services and looking at taxes in the same way. The questions for people will be the same. And so what we've got to do is to be ready to ride that zeitgeist and to work locally wherever that is.
Because local, I mean, we are facing not just a national enemy, we're facing a global enemy. You know, I mean, it's very important to build local branches, but what about, you know, building a national fight back? And back to Graham on that, because when I listen to you, it's what's going on with the unions is very important, but there are huge problems in the unions as well. There is a huge lack of democracy and a lack of transparency when it comes to trade unions. We've got another fight there that we have to go through as well, isn't it?
Of course, that's true. And of course, we've got to build nationally. But I think that the one lesson we've learned is a top-down type of politics isn't just going to be effective in this period. So I think it's both fighting in our localities, then linking up those local struggles on a clear, strong political basis. And there are various lessons of the Corbyn years that go beyond the problems of momentum. The whole problem of the left in that period was that it was weak on some of the fundamental issues. It didn't look outwards to those in struggle. It faced insuperable problems, the most left-wing leadership in Labour's history, with one of the weakest Labour movements we've had for years, which is only beginning to recover. So it was always problematic. No simple answers. But I think, of course, fight for union democracy, fight for firm political principle, fight locally, link up nationally. It's easy said, hard to do. And I only hope we can do better next time, because there won't be too many more next times.
Yep. And Redline TV is very much part of this process of trying to rebuild the left on a national, local, international basis. And we are very much trying to play an important role in that. If you support what we're doing, if you're enjoying the discussions we're featuring, please consider becoming a patron via Patreon and support us with a small donation, large donation, whatever you can afford would be fantastic. Jackie, did you want to say something? You had your hand up.
No, I didn't actually. I was just kind of waving about. Because I think the thing is, this separation between the local and the international or the national is totally so false, as we see with the energy crisis. The reasons for the energy crisis are both national and international, but we somehow have to get back to where we can feel and we can make people locally feel empowered enough to think that their voice makes a difference and matters. And the problem we have now with Labour, also within the trades union movement in many instances, and certainly with the Tories, is that actually most people don't think their voice matters there. And the only way we can make a difference is to join together and work in solidarity as individuals joining together for one purpose, which is to make our communities and the wider community a better place.
and the world.
Hallelujah.
Hallelujah. Comrades, thank you for joining us. Next week, we're discussing this again, this issue in Have Your Say. If you want to speak next week and tell us what's happened locally, or have you been able to vote, etc., get in touch and we will be happy to feature you. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Thank you to all our speakers and for coming on for the interesting discussion. Bye-bye, comrades. Bye.
Good night.